This next week we're going to be talking about the first part of the American Revolution, and we're going to be dealing with the protests of the colonists. And we're going to be looking specifically at how a government's actions impact the citizens and how people tend to justify or basically explain their actions based on ideas or principles that they live by. We're also going to talk about how new ideas can lead to conflict and change, and how individuals and groups have always struggled for equality. Eventually we're going to be talking about how leadership will play a major outcome in a war. Now, some of these new ideas were introduced to you during the colonial unit when we talked about the Enlightenment, and those were ideas that had to do with natural rights and individual rights and the idea of limiting the powers of government. Now, there were some indications that things were changing in the colonies. There was an early court case known as the Zinger Trial that was an early defense of the freedom of the press. There was the French and Indian War, which we studied in class last week, and we start to see the origination of the idea of the colonies uniting together. And with the changes physically in the shape of the colonies, they then expanded from the Appalachian Mountains all the way out to the Mississippi River. However, in 1763, the king issued a proclamation saying that he did not want the colonists to go west of the Appalachian Mountains. Matter of fact, he forbid it. And this was really upsetting to the colonists, because one of the reasons that they had fought the French and Indian War was so they could go and settle in the Ohio River Valley. In addition to that, Parliament, or the government in England, passed several taxes on sugar. They passed a quartering act that said that you had to give shelter and food to any soldiers who appeared at your house. And then they passed the Stamp Act, which was a tax on paper, essentially. What that said is that if you wanted to pay to have a legal document produced, you had to also pay a tax in silver. This was then followed with the Townshend Acts, which was a tax on lead, glass, paper, paint, and tea. And this was eventually repealed and replaced specifically with a tax on tea. And we'll be discussing each of these in class. In addition to these economic sanctions, there were also some that people in the colonists felt violated their personal freedoms, and these were known as writs of assistance, which gave the government permission to go into anybody's business or home and search for smuggled goods at any times. The combination of all this led several of the colonists to join secret societies, such as the Sons of Liberty, which were led by a gentleman in Boston named Sam Adams, who their sole purpose was to protest these acts of Parliament. Now, one of the major ways that they were able to protest these economic policies of Parliament was by boycotting British-made goods. And instead of buying goods from England, many of the colonists started making their own instead. Now, eventually, these self-governments that had been created in the colonies sent representatives, and they wrote a petition to both King George and Parliament asking him to repeal the Sugar and the Stamp Act. And Parliament did. But then they passed the Declaratory Act, which declared that Parliament had the supreme power to write whatever laws they felt were needed in the colonies. We're specifically going to look at two events that took place in Boston, the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. We're going to look at how some of these protests were examples of civil disobedience. It's where you choose to break the law knowing that you're going to have to accept the consequences. And the main idea of these next few weeks is we're going to look at how the colonies went from a period of protest to the movement for independence, and eventually this all will culminate in the American Revolution. Now, after you finish watching this video, if you'd like, it is available in PowerPoint on my website. And after that, you need to go and take the quiz on Edmodo.